Hi everybody, it's Andre from MomentumWingChun. Today I'd like to talk to you about a concept called counter rotations. It's a concept, again, that I didn't invent myself at all. It does actually surprise me that I didn't know about it for so long in my Wing Chun career, and it's a very helpful concept to understand in terms of power generation and rotations of the joints relative to the different forms. It can be a little bit of a handful to understand at times, so I'm going to do my best to try and explain this as simply as I possibly can. To start off with, the first thing we're going to have to do is we'll do a shot on the ground just so I can give an example of rotations working together. So counter rotations, for starters, essentially is just things that are turning relative to each other, or in this case, as per the previous video we've shot where we talked about relativity, this might turn around this object this way, this object could turn around it this way, or the two together could be doing that relative to each other. The counter rotation essentially just being this thing turns this way, so this one turns the opposite way. So now if I want to initiate a rotation, there's two ways that can happen. Assuming this is now the center of my mass, my spine, if I wanted to have the shoulder joints open up, or just in general have things move apart, if I push this forward, the result is that the other two objects will open up. So let's, just for the purpose of terminology, anything that's going to turn away this way is going to be opening, and anything that comes in like that is going to be closing. So by pushing this forward, the result is I get two opening forces where both sides open up the same at the same time. But now if all three are in line, and if I could only access the center here to make this spin, I'm going to have to cheat a little bit because these aren't connected with cogs, so I will have to move the outside ones, but for the purpose of this example, we shall assume that the power is generated from the center here, being my spine, so I'm turning around the center of my body. If I now turn this way, the result is that the two outside objects now go in opposing directions, meaning this one here, for example, now is closing, while the other side here is opening up. So if we have body rotation in work, then this is essentially what happens. If I have body motion coming first, the body motion will then give the result of both of these opening up. It's very important to understand the order of the powers for later on as well, because body motion always has precedent over body rotation, so the body motion is going to dictate if we are opening or if we are going to be doing a closing type move. So the two counter rotations we spoke about is essentially the push-pull. So if that was my center here, by moving the center forward, the result will be that the two other wheels are going to be opening up on an outwards motion. Or the rotation, if I rotated around the center, the result will be that one is going to be opening while the other one is closing. How does this now relate to our body? We essentially have our center, but because our center is not just on one plane, so we're not flat, we can actually move in 3 dimensions. And what I mean with the 3 dimensions is I have the option of turning this way essentially. So that would be this axis here. I have the option of turning my body this way. So that would be this axis. But then I also have the horizontal axis where I have the option of turning my body like this. So in the counter rotations, how this relates is I have my center of mass here, and then I have essentially 4 ball joints that connect to my center, being my hips and my shoulders. So we could imagine that all this is just one big chain of balls connected, and so if I turn the center, something else happens to these other balls. To make things a bit more simple, I'll talk about one axis at a time. So if I turn, and by the way, everything starts off, or is it analysed in the term of arm at rest. So if I just hang my arm like this, even if it was up here or back here or whatever, the same principles relative to my centre will always apply because it's a ball joint. So I'll start with the horizontal axis. If I think of my spine turning this way, in exaggeration I'm doing this, the result would be that over here I'm going to be opening up. So because my body's turning this way, the shoulder is going to be opening. Same thing going in the reverse. If I'm turning that way, right now the shoulder would be turning inwards, and I'm essentially closing the rotation. So the two things are turning in, opening and closing. So that would be on the horizontal. So for example, in Sil Lim Tau, if I'm doing a punch like this, I'm actually thinking of my belly turning this way to pull the punch in an opening move. I don't actually do this in Sil Lim Tau. You don't see it happen, but you still think the feeling of this is being pulled that way. And then, for example, if I come back in a torso, I think of my belly now turning this way to close this gate and bring it back in. Again, I don't actually do a full turn in my body in Sil Lim Tau, but I still feel that the belly is now rotating this way on any move that is coming backwards. So that's the forward move. So anything going forward, I rotate away, in this case from my left hand, and anything coming back, I rotate into the shape. If we now take that on the next axis, being this one, so we looked at this axis here. If we now take it onto this axis, essentially, if I have my shoulder here and my center here, if I want my shoulder to be doing this, so again the arm going forward, the rotation right now would be like this. Let's go like that. The rotation would be like that. So for this rotation to happen, according to the order of the powers, everything starts from the center. So if I want my shoulder to be doing this, my center needs to be doing that. So I again need to have the counter rotation, which means for a punch or this type of move or anything going forward essentially, so anything from here going towards the opponent, at that moment I think of my belly dropping down on the front. So my belly turns down to generate power driving forward. Now we'll talk about the vertical axis, so that would be essentially the rotation of my center going this way versus my shoulder now doing this. So if I want my shoulder to be turning like that for a forward move, that could be a punch, it could be a palm strike, it could be a fook sao, tan sao, it doesn't matter. Essentially on this plane right now the shoulder is doing that. For that to happen, my center needs to be turning this way, because it's always the center that initiates all the following moves according to the order of the powers. So I need my belly to be turning like that. So really, any punch that I'm doing, I just think about my belly dropping down forward, which makes this rotation happen that way. And then the opposite coming back. So if I wanted to do a torso coming back, so for the arm to rotate this way, so I want now this to happen. For my elbow to drop down and my shoulder to turn that way, I need essentially the opposite rotation. So in this moment what I do is I think of my belly rotating up this way and my back dropping down like that. And what I find very helpful when you do any of the coming back moves, obviously the body's still projecting forward, everything's always projecting forward, but I envision my coccyx dropping down and pointing up through the shape, so I actually create like a big circle that's turning this way. And then if I wanted to go forward again, now think of my belly dropping down forward to move this way, and then as I come back again, my belly is going to rotate up. So that's the vertical axis. And then we also have, I guess it's kind of vertical as well, but we'll call it the sideways axis. So I can turn this way or that way to make this or this happen, or this as well, because this is actually quite relevant coming across here, because for the punch, the elbow actually comes inwards. As I'm doing the punch for the fuksao, tansao, everything, the elbow has an inwards movement happening. So in this moment, my shoulder is actually doing this, or it will be the same from here, I'm just rotating that way. So again, for this rotation to happen, I need the center to be turning in that way. So what that means is if I'm doing a punch or tansao or fuksao, I think of my belly turning this way to pull the elbow in, and then the opposite again, coming back, I actually think of my belly turning that way. So it feels like the weight's kind of wanting to drop down on this side as I'm coming back, and then as I go forward, I feel like my belly's doing that. Now again, this is just exaggeration to visually illustrate the example. You don't actually put your weight on this foot and then on that foot. You always seek 50-50 distribution on both feet when you're doing Sil Lim Tau, but it does feel as if we're sort of turning this side and that side depending if we're going to go forward or backwards. So quick summary, everything going forward, belly drops down as we go forward like that, belly turns this way as the punch is coming in like that, and the belly turns away as we do the punch this way, and then the opposite for something coming back. On the horizontal, we'll be turning this way, we'll be turning upwards to bring it back, and our weight drops onto this side of our belly. So that's the three counter rotations in the context of Sil Lim Tau. Hope you can follow me so far. We're going to add another level into this now, and we're going to talk about counter rotations in Chum Kiu and relative to body motion. In Chum Kiu, we have body rotation much more extremely obviously than we have in Sil Lim Tau. So if I do, well, let's just say, let's use this shape here for an example. If I want to do this move, in Sil Lim Tau, this rotation here, a bong sao, would actually be a closing relationship. So relative to the bong sao, my center would have to go this way. But that's because there's no body motion. Now if I add body motion in Chum Kiu, because body motion and rotation have precedent before anything that happens in the arm and the shoulder, in Chum Kiu I'm turning away this way now, so that even if I'm doing a bong sao shape with my fingers, the relationship between my center and my shoulder joint now is actually an opening one. And then the opposite coming back, so if I turn into the shape that way, the relationship now is a closing one, even though the rotation here is actually going into what would have been in Sil Lim Tau an opening way. In Sil Lim Tau you can simplify it. Anything that's going thumb-wise or bong sao-wise is always going to be rotating inwards. Anything that goes towards a pinky or sort of a tansao way is always going to be opening. In Chum Kiu now this all doesn't matter. It all just comes down to what the body is actually doing. So if the body's turning into the shape, it's going to be closing. If it's turning away from the shape, it's going to be opening. The same thing applies to the hips, and this is actually quite an interesting one because it helped me a lot with my pivoting. If I want to pivot this way, the spine is going to be turning that way. And as I'm turning this way, what's happening is I'm closing here because I'm turning into the hip joint, and I'm opening up here. So as I do the rotation, I think of the hip opening up on this side, and I think of the hip dropping in on this side as the spine moves over here. And then the same thing if I want to turn the other way. Now I'm going to open up the hip here, and I'm going to let this close as I do the rotation. What happens in the legs is going to be the same for Chum Kiu and Biu Gee in terms of the opening and closing. Chum Kiu and Biu Gee, though, the difference is in Biu Gee I don't have any body motion. The weight distribution stays 50-50 all the while as I do diagonals on the shoulders. Anyway, we'll get to that. Okay, so that's the legs counter rotation for Chum Kiu and what happens in the arms. One rule of thumb for Chum Kiu, because in Chum Kiu hips and shoulders are always parallel and we're essentially just moving on one plane, is that the hip and the shoulder always have the same relationship. So if I turn this way, the hip will be opening up, the shoulder will be opening up, and this side here, the shoulder and the hip are closing. So that applies for all shapes. If I do this, I'm opening here, closing here. And then as I come back, I'll be closing on both sides while I'm opening these two sides. So that's the characteristic of Chum Kiu. We've always got the same side opening and closing. The result is a propelling force. So that if there was a person giving you resistance, they would feel like they're being pushed away, or could be pulled in as well, but it's essentially a push-pull force. Now when we do Biu Gee, the interesting thing is we do it in diagonals. So even though the legs, let's say I'm going to do a Biu Gee pivot this way, this leg is still going to be closing, this hip is going to be opening, but now in the shoulders, this shoulder here is going to be doing a closing movement, while this one's going to be doing an opening type move. So this shoulder is opening now if I go that way, this shoulder is going to be closing, but the hips don't change. So that's really the three characteristics of the counter rotations for Sil Lim Tau. Essentially anything going forward, Tan says I was going to be opening, coming back, but closing. Chum Kiu, the body rotation will dictate if we are opening or closing respectively. And then in Biu Gee, you're always going to have the diagonal, so you're always going to be closing, and opening, or vice versa.